If you think to be a great photographer, you need to buy the most expensive gear, it's a lie. Have you ever imagined you want to shoot something extraordinary and then you shoot it, turns out very different and very poor, and you don't know why? In this series of videos, we're going to take you through the basics of photography. We're going to look at how the camera works, basics of lighting, composition, and photo editing. With this, you're set for your journey to professional photography world. In this segment, we're going to talk about how the camera works. What is a camera? A camera is basically a dark box with a tiny hole in one side. The light passes through that hole and makes a projection at the back of the box. Now, this is basic pinhole camera. When I was a kid, we used to make this. Try and experiment with it. It's so much fun. That hole that the light passes through is what we call aperture. As the light is passing through that hole, it then hits a light-sensitive surface. In the days of film, that would have been film, which is a surface that is sensitive to light. These days, it's digital sensor. The other thing is that before the light hits that digital sensor, it has to pass through a door that opens and closes. That is what is called the shutter. So we have three major things that affect exposure, and this is the basic working of the camera: the aperture, the shutter speed, and the digital sensor measured in ISO. So people say aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now we'll talk about the aperture. Like I said, the aperture is this hole through which light gets into your camera. It controls the quantity of light that gets into the camera. It is measured in f-stops. It's much like your pupil in the eyes. So if there is a lot of light, your pupil will close down. If there is very little light, let's say at night, pupil will dilate. So that is how it works. If you look at this camera, for instance, you can see how the thing opens and closes. And if you look at the top of the camera, you see the numbers. Those are the f-stops. With each click, you either make wider or narrower. This controls the quantity of light that comes into your camera, but it does also control the depth of field. Depth of field is the area of sharpness from the point of focus. If you focus your camera on a particular object, the foreground and the background can either be sharp or blurred. Now that's what we mean by depth of field. The area of sharpness, how big is it from the point of focus? Now this becomes very useful when you want to make a photograph. Let's say I want to photograph Queenette over here, and you can see that the background itself is really busy. So what we want to achieve here with a shallow depth of field is a blurred background while our subject is sharp. Turn a little to the side. There. You can see that the background is pretty blurred, and that's what gives you that beautiful portrait feel. However, if you want a much wider depth of field, which means you want things to be sharp from the foreground to the deep background, this happens mostly when you're shooting landscapes, for instance, okay? What you're going to do is to stop down your aperture to almost the lowest. Mind you, the bigger the number, the smaller the aperture. So we're looking at, let's say, an aperture of f22, f11, f16 to get this kind of feeling. So let's say you want to shoot a range of mountains and you want your picture to be sharp from the foreground to the background. This is how you make this kind of picture. The aperture then becomes an instrument to make things much sharper. We also use it when we're doing a group photograph, okay? And you have a lot of people, some people in the back, some people in front, to be sharp. It's important. Not only does it affect quantity of light that comes into your camera, it also affects the way the image even looks in terms of depth of field. Now, the second part of the exposure triangle is your shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is a measure of how long it takes for light to be on your sensor, and that is controlled by your shutter that opens and closes, like your eye blinking. So if it opens and then it closes, there is a duration of time that passes between when it opens and when it closes, and that is what is called shutter speed. The light is exposed a little longer, it gets brighter. If the light is exposed within a shorter time, it gets darker. So this is one of the major elements. Apart from affecting how light or dark your image can be, there is another effect that your shutter speed has on the image. It can be used creatively to create what is called motion blur to your image, okay? But most often than not, we want our image to be sharp. When the shutter speed is very slow, you run the risk, if you're hand holding your camera, of what is called motion blur. So your pictures may not be sharp because you're moving. There are ways to solve this by putting your camera on a tripod if you're shooting objects that are not moving. On the other hand, if you really want to stop action, then you need to operate at very high shutter speeds. Now, this shutter speed is measured in fractions of a second. So do not get confused when you see the shutter speed of 1000 or shutter speed of 60. It's not 60 seconds. It's 1/60th of a second. So you have to take a second and cut it into 60 bits, and that is the duration of that exposure. Most times, you are encouraged to put your camera on a tripod if it is below shutter speed of 50. If you want to photograph an athlete that is doing a high jump at the Olympics, for instance, you don't want any motion blur. So you may switch your shutter speed to, let's say, 1000th of a second and freeze that movement in time. There are also creative pictures where there is a splash of water and you shoot at very high shutter speeds, 1000th to 1000th of a second, and you stop the water, freeze it very unrealistically. There's what is called panning, where you're following an object with your camera, the object becomes sharp and the background becomes blurred. Now that can be very interesting if you're trying to show movement. You know, it's a still photograph, but you can show an illusion of movement by using motion blur. Now, sometimes when we shoot nighttime photography and we're shooting the city, you can use it and get those light trails. Also, when you're shooting fireworks, you want to get those beautiful, designs. On the more advanced side, you can do light painting, with slow shutter speed. There is a lot that you can do, with it. A lot of times, the early days of my photography, I used to play around with very long shutter speeds and using flash to do the exposure in pure darkness. That could be a lesson for another day. Apart from affecting the duration of exposure, which then makes your picture either lighter or darker, your shutter speed can also be used as a creative tool to create visual effects on your photographs through motion blur. The third element, which is the last element of the exposure triangle, is what is called ISO. Now, ISO, it is in relation to your digital sensor or your film. This is the light sensitive surface that registers your image. What is ISO? ISO is the sensitivity of that surface. The more sensitive the surface, the more light it shows. The less sensitive the surface, the less light it shows. So you can see that all these three elements affect whether there's going to be more light or there's going to be less light. So it's a combination of three of them that will get you to your exposure, and it is measured in numbers. Most digital cameras come at a native ISO of 100. The more advanced ones can go even lower than 164, 60 ISO. And then they can go as high as 20,000 ISO, 15,000 ISO, 6,000 ISO, 1,000 ISO. The higher you go, the more sensitive your digital sensor, the more light your camera is going to see. This becomes very useful when you want to operate at very high shutter speeds or at very small apertures. Those other two elements that may reduce the amount of light for the purpose of your creative endeavor or because there is very little light you're shooting at night. Now, please watch out. There is a serious disadvantage to high ISOs. Depending on the sophistication of your camera, very high ISO could cause what is called noise. And when you have noise, it can be very ugly. It reduces the sharpness digital noise is really not nice. So we want to avoid that. You don't want to be shooting at an ISO that will take your camera into the zone of digital noise. How do you solve this? Open up your aperture. Get lenses that have very wide aperture. Work with slightly slower shutter speeds to get more light in so that you don't have to. So if it is something that is not moving, put your camera on a tripod and shoot at a very slow shutter speed. You can avoid noise. To illustrate this, what you're looking at now on this video is us shooting at an ISO of 100, which is the native base ISO of this camera. Well, what you are shooting with the Nikon Z9. See what is going to happen as we take the ISO as high as ISO 25,000. Now this is ISO 25,000. There you are, basics of how the camera works. This is the first in a series of videos we are going to be giving you, taking you through the beginner course on photography. To master this, you have to practice. Just drop this video, pick up your camera and start fiddling with your shutter speed, aperture and ISO. It is only through practice that you will internalize this thing. You start to understand the numbers, you start to understand the different combinations. Now we're going to give you future videos that even delve into more details in the creative uses of these elements. And once you've mastered this, you are graduating from keeping your camera on automatic to being able to use your camera on manual. Now you've taken over the brain of this camera, so you can use a more intelligent brain that is yours. If this was extremely useful to you, do not hesitate to send us a note. Subscribe and put on your notifications. See you in the next video.